Today we're going to talk about information asymmetry. What is information asymmetric? Here's one sort of famous example, which is known as the market for lemons. Here we're not talking about the fruit market. Instead, we're talking about used car market. And lemons here refers to bad used car with hidden defects. So if you go to the used car market and try to get a used car, there's a great uncertainty regarding the quality of the car. Okay? And there may be many lemons, bad used car with low quality there. Among them, there might be some peach, which is here would be sweet and refer to good used car without much problems, okay? As compared to the sour lemons. It's called the market for lemons because the one who come up with the initial idea refer to those bad used car as lemons, and the economist who come up with the idea is George Akerlof in the 1970s, and it turned out that this idea, although really simple, revolutionized economics, and for that he, amongst other people, who is what we will talk about today, got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001. Okay, so think about a used car market with two kind of cars. Right? One kind of cars is the good used car with good quality, no major problem, no hidden defects. Okay? For that kind of car, buyers is willing to pay $30,000 for it, and the seller of that kind of car is willing to sell it for $25,000. Right? So here we have buyer valuing the car more than the seller, and so that could be a mutually beneficial trade. Okay. On the other hand, there are bad used car. Okay, and if the car have low quality, buyers still want to buy it, but only value it at $10,000 for the used car. Seller is willing to sell a low quality used car at $5,000. But again, buyers' willingness to pay is larger than the value of the car to the seller, so there could be a mutually beneficial trade between them. Okay. The problem in this market is that there's information asymmetry. In particular, what it means is seller knows the car's quality, but the buyer does not. Okay. So the buyer and the seller, both of them know that 50% of the cars in the used car market are good used car, and 50% of them are bad used car. But when we talk about one particular car, whether it's good or bad, only the seller know about the quality. The buyer will have no idea beyond that. There's a 50% chance this is good and 50% chance this is bad. Okay, so information asymmetric between the seller and the buyer. And let's see what happened then. Right? So the buyer, not knowing whether he or she is buying a good used car or bad used car, is only willing to pay for the expected value of the car. Right? Half the car is good, so half times 30, and half the car is bad, so half times 10. And so the buyer is willing to pay up to $20,000 for a car with uncertain quality. Okay, but if that is the case, right, the seller is not willing to sell its car if its car is a good used car, right? So because a seller with a good used car valued the car at $25,000. So the seller of a good used car will say, no, I'm not going to sell it. And what happened is we are left with that used car, the lemons, in the used car market, right? So again, notice that if there's symmetric information, if both buyer and seller know whether they're buying or selling a good used car or a bad one, then regardless whether the car has good quality or bad quality, there could be a mutually beneficial trade. But the problem is with asymmetric information, we have market failure. And this kind of phenomenon is known as adverse selection. Usually when we think about selection, we think about picking the good one. Right? In this context, in this example, the opposite happened. Right? The good used car seller dropped out of the market. Okay? And therefore, we are left with lemons in the market. Okay? So there's a missing market for the good used car. There's a market failure because of this kind of information asymmetric. Okay? So that sort of explains that what we often see, which is when a used car, when a new car got sold, its value dropped the moment it is sold. Right? And the drop in value is not due to normal depreciation. Right? If it sort of, usually we think about depreciation as pretty gradually. It can't be that the moment it's sold, it suddenly depreciates a lot. Right? So from the data, sort of, this is sort of a picture from a consumer sort of website. Over time, the values, sort of the resale value of a car drop, and that reflects in part depreciation, but it dropped much quicker at the beginning, and so part of it would reflects this kind of transaction cost, right, from the asymmetric information, from the adverse selection we just talked about. And some people call this lemon penalty. Right? And to sort of test this seminal idea by George Akerlof, recently there's a number of researchers, Richard Bundell, along with other people, they get some really good data from Denmark, and they estimate the lemon's effect, right, or the lemon penalty. So what they look at is, well, how would the average value of a used car change over time? So this is year to when the car was new and got purchased it, and then as years go by, ownership duration increase. Not surprisingly, the average value of a used car drop, right, as a percentage of the new car, right. So this is the sort of upper curve, but they also look at the price at which dealer purchase used car, right? And again, not surprisingly, the purchase price drop as the car get older and so on. But there's a gap between these two. When the ownership years is like 6 years or 7 years, the gap is pretty small. It just give a small profit for the dealer. But at the beginning, in the first couple years, there's a large gap. And in particular, they estimate that the lemons penalty is about 18% of the price of a new car in the first year of the ownership. Right? So the drop in resale value reflects the lemon penalty, the information asymmetric inherent in the used car market when we have this adverse selection problem. Okay, and I think that's give really nice sort of empirical support from the data, illustrating the issue of adverse selection in the used car market. So we focus on used car in our example because that's a salient sort of case, a salient market with pretty striking quality uncertainty. But it turns out that information asymmetry is pervasive in the economy. Right? Not only exists in the used car market, although the used car market by itself is fairly large a market, but it turned out that it exists in many, many other contexts as well. And one would argue that in sort of almost all aspects of the economy, there's more or less some sort of information asymmetry, right? Which is not surprising because one would sort of think naturally, nobody knows exactly the same thing, right? So I'll give you some example. Here we can think about the insurance market, and in particular the car insurance market. Right? So a driver will pay an insurance premium, which is sort of the annual or monthly fee they pay to the car insurance company in exchange for insurance. So if there's an accident, there's a loss, there's a damage, the insurance company will pay out to compensate the driver. So that's the price of the insurance. Right? In the markets, there could be two kinds of driver. We could have prudent driver who typically would drive carefully and only get into accident with low probability. Okay, and for those prudent driver, because they have low chance of getting into accident, the cost to insure them is pretty low, and so the insurance company is willing to pay, willing to insure that kind of driver with, let's say, $20 per month, right? And the driver is willing to pay $30 per month, okay, for that insurance. Again, there's a mutually beneficial trade. And the thing is, in the market, there is another kind of driver, the red list driver here, who doesn't drive that carefully and get into accident more often. For that reason, it's more costly for the insurance company to insure them. And for the same reason that they got into accident more, they might be willing to pay more for the insurance. Again, there would be mutually beneficial trade between them. Assuming that they have have the same sort of size in the population, again, there is information asymmetric, except that now it's not the seller of the goods or service having more information, but rather the buyer of the insurance, the driver, will have more information, right? So the driver know whether they are a prudent driver or red list driver, right? They may not know for sure, but most likely they know better than the insurance company, right? So without sort of knowing whether the driver is a prudent driver, a red list driver, and only knowing that is of half the chance that they are prudent driver, the insurance company is only willing to insure if they got paid with half 50 and 70, which is 35, right? But again, the problem is with insurance company charging 35 for the premium or more, they're not sort of going to attract the prudent driver, right? The prudent driver is only willing to pay $30, right? So then they would sort of drop out of the market and not buying the insurance from the insurance company. And then we are left with the red list driver in the insurance market. And again, we have an adverse selection problem. Right? Is the credit market, the market of borrowing and lending. Right? So suppose a borrower would like to sort of borrow some money to fund some project. Let's say entrepreneur have some idea and try to invest. The borrower, if he or she got a safe project, right, which have low probability to fail, and so the borrower is willing to pay 7%. The lender is willing to lend at a lower rate at 5%. So again, that could be a mutually beneficial trade, right? The borrowing and lending. On the other hand, there's another kind of borrower. They have risky projects, and with risky project, the potential gain could be higher, but it's more likely that they will fail, and if they fail, they would default, and then the lender could lose money, and for that, the lender would like a higher interest rate to compensate for that kind of risk and potential loss. Right? But again, that's of interest rate demand by lender is less than the interest rate the borrower is willing to pay. So that could be, again, mutually beneficial trade. The problem, though, is that only the borrower know whether they have a safe project or risky project, right? So not knowing the potential borrower, whether the borrower have a safe project or risky project, the lender is only willing to pay the average of these two. So that's 6%, but then with 6%, borrower with a safe project would say, no, not going to lend, not going to borrow. And for that reason, we are left with risky project in the credit market, and we have a market failure in the credit market, okay? So you might say, well, that's sort of pretty special. You have only two kind of types of goods, which may not, so means that in reality, when we have different kind of goods, we have the same problem. And even if we have two kind of goods, only sort of the market fail for half of them. So here, let's see whether sort of the idea extend to more goods, right? And more kind of goods, sort of more levels of quality in the used car market. So suppose that we have 4 different levels of quality: excellent, good, fair, and poor. Okay, and so for the excellent quality used car, the buyer is willing to pay so $50,000 for the used car. For the good quality used car, the buyer is only willing to pay $45. For fair quality used car, $43. Poor quality used car, $42. Okay, so each of them account for a quarter of the cars in the market. Right? And in this market, the seller of each kind of quality used car is willing to sell the car at a price slightly lower than buyer's value. Let's say $400, like 0.4, lower than the buyer's value. So that ensures that for each kind of quality, there could be a mutually beneficial trade between the buyer and seller if they have symmetric information, if both the buyer and seller know about the quality of the car. Market unraveling, right? So essentially, the market collapsed, and sort of it's like sort of it got into a death spiral. But again, the thing here is that they don't both know about the quality of car, right? So imagine that at the beginning, a buyer not knowing the quality of car, except knowing that there are four quality level, each kind of quality account for 25% of the cars in the market. So not knowing exact quality of the car, the buyer is only willing to pay the expected value of the car, which is sort of a quarter times 40, a quarter times 45, a quarter times 42, right? And then add them up, right? So that's the expected value of the car, and they give us $45,000. Okay. But the thing is, so if the expected value is 45, and the seller of an excellent used car is willing to sell the car at around $50,000 minus $400, well, that would be 49 something. The excellent car, the car with excellent quality, would not be sold. Right? The seller valued the car more than 45, and so the seller of excellent quality used car would say, no, I'm not going to sell, and drop out of the market. And after the excellent used car drop off the market, again, the buyer would need to do another sort of calculation of what would be the expected value, right? So we're left with 3 kind of car. Expected value will be this, and if they add them up, it gives us about $43,000. Again, the seller of good used car here would say, well, that's too low. I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to sell it. So they would drop out of the market, right? And after that, another round of calculation of expected value from the buyer give us that number, 42.5. Again, the seller of a fair used car is only willing to sell if he got at least 42.6, right? And that's higher than the willingness to pay by the buyer, so they would drop out as well. So at the end of the day, we only left with poor quality used car in the market, and this kind of phenomenon is not sequentially different kind of seller drop out of the market, so that at the end of the day, only a small portion of the car got sold in the market. Okay, and so this idea of average selection, you can see that could extend to a more general setting that will have different level of quality, right? And we can sort of extend the idea of market unraveling when we sort of extend to more kind of quality, so a higher number of quality level as well. Okay. So with that, right, you might ask, well, so if that is the case, the market fell, there would be a lot of inefficiency there. How would people deal with it, right? So in practice, people try to do something to mitigate those effects, those inefficiency. And for example, in the used car market, many car manufacturers would create what is known as certified pre-owned programs, right? So for example, this photo sort of show a Ford used car, right? So what they do in this kind of certified pre-owned program is that a car manufacturer would buy used car of their own brand, like those they manufacture before, and they would sort of check the used car, inspect the used car to see whether the used car had problem, and if not, they certify it. If there's a small problem, they try to fix it, and sort of and make sure the car with reasonably good quality. And so after they do that, they sort of certify the car as like say quality check, certified pre-owned, and then sell it. Right. So with this kind of program, the buyer in the used car could be so reasonably more confident that the car meet a certain level of quality. Right. Okay. So you could also see that not just in the used car market, but in say in the iPhone or iPad market as well. Right? So for example, if you go to the website of Apple and you can find a section that they sell not just new iPhone, but refurbished iPhone. Right? So those are the iPhone that Apple got it has been used before, and what they do, Apple would sort of reinstall the software, update the software, change the battery, maybe even changing the screen, and so to make it looks better, check the quality of the phone. It's kind of like their own certified quality program, right? So and so after they check that, people could sort of buy a used phone, but with a bit more confident about the quality of the phone, because at the end of the day, Apple, who manufactured the phone, has inspected the phone, right? So that's sort of some other way business in the market try to deal with the information. In the credit markets, remember we also mentioned that there could be information asymmetric in the borrowing and lending market as well. In the consumer lending and borrowing market, the consumer credit market, in many countries, certainly in Australia and the US, most developed country, there's some sort of system of credit reporting. Basically, what happened is I could sort of check my credit score in some sort of website or company sort of design so that not only the other financial institution can check my credit score, right? So when but I could check as banks, your financial institution that you have relationship with, would report your credit history to an agency. So, for example, I have a credit card with Commonwealth Bank of Australia, one of the largest one in Australia. And they would sort of report my credit history to some credit agency. So if if some month I don't pay my credit card bill, and they would sort of mark it all that month, no payment, missed payment, or late payment, so forth, and that would damage my credit score, right? Because I maintain reasonably good credit history, pay my bill on time, I got okay credit score. And if I go to another bank and try to borrow, even if I have not do business with that bank, they could check my credit score and know that, oh, this is someone with a reasonable good credit history, and so they might be willing to lend me money for another credit card, for a loan for a car, or for mortgage, right? So, and this is sort of another sort of mechanism in the market where people try to sort of mitigate the information asymmetric by just reduce the information asymmetric, right? To make sure the two sides would have a smaller gap in terms of information. Okay. There's another really important way that people try to deal with information asymmetric, and that's signaling. Okay, so what is signaling? Signaling is to engage in a costly activity for the purpose of credibly convince the others of your type, right? So if you, so in the previous example, we might want to convince other people that I'm a sort of someone who always pay the bill, pay back the loan, and so on. And signaling is a way to, by doing something that is costly, to sort of signal to other that you are that kind of person or corporation, right? And know that this is different from just talk, right? Which often we call cheap talks, right? There's a saying, talks are cheap, right? You can always tell other people you are amazing, you have the safest project to invest, you have low risk in getting into a car accident and so on. But there's no particular reason other people should believe you, right? It's just top, everybody can top, right? And that's why they're saying tops are cheap, right? So signaling is different because this costly activity, okay? And we'll see what does it mean in a more specific context later on, okay? But for now, just keep in mind that for the signaling to work, it has to be costly, but it's relatively less costly for the type you're trying to convince the other, okay? And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We'll see later on what does it mean. Okay, so here are some examples of signaling. So you can see that firms engage in advertising all the time. Sometimes the advertising is informative, such as if you're a buyer for an iPhone, you might want to know, well, how large is the screen, what is the camera's resolution, how many pixels are there, and what is the CPU, is it fast, what is the memory, storage, and so on, right? So, and firm might have incentive to just advertise those information, right? So those will be informative advertisement. But there's a lot of uninformative advertisement, right? So it just show up some celebrity holding the product and enjoying it. It's not informative, right, at all in terms of what consumer might be looking for. Why they do that? Right? Well, one way to think about it is that they're trying to signal. In particular, they're trying to convince consumer that their products are popular, right? And by showing that, they could afford to burn cash on advertising, right? So even if advertisement is not going to tell you something you don't know already in terms of what the products are, it could tell you, it could signal you that the product of the firms is popular, right? And if only firms with more popular product can afford to burn the cash or spend money on advertisement, then it could be a credible signal, right? So that's one example. The other example is why car manufacturer would sell new car with warranty. Right? Warranty is say 3 years, which is typical in the new car manufacturing. Basically, if you have any problem of the car, some quality problem with the car, you can return it, and the manufacturer will fix it for you. Okay. So maybe the manufacturer would sort of trying to sort of convince consumer that their product are reliable, right? So if they give a warranty, if their product are not reliable, they will need to spend money to fix it. And so and you see that sort of car manufacturer may be trying to sort of signal that their products are reliable by giving out warranty or longer warranty. Right? So, for example, if you look at Hyundai, the Korea car manufacturer, they are relatively new compared to many other older car manufacturers in the U.S., in Europe, and even in Japan. So they sort of enter North America relatively late. They compare with low price, and so people perceive those cars as cheap, but not necessarily reliable, right? And that's the problem earlier Japanese car manufacturer had, and later on the Korea car manufacturer have, and maybe later on later on the Chinese car manufacturer might have, right? Certainly, the Japanese and electronic device producer, and later on Chinese electronic device producer had those problems in developed economy. So what Hyundai does is say, okay, we are going to give a 5-year warranty, okay, for new vehicle, and for some components, engine, the key component, transmission, we give them a 10-year warranty. If you have problem with those key components, just return the car. We're going to fix it for you for free, right? So what they try to do is to signal to the consumer their products are reliable, right? If not, they are going to need to spend tons of money on fixing the problem, right? And that makes the signaling credible, because if compared to a car manufacturer with low quality product, it's relatively less costly for them to promise that. Okay, they compared to those who components might break down a lot. Okay, so that's the idea of signaling, and later on we will get into more detail and have more in-depth analysis. For that, there's the idea of a dynamic game with incomplete information. Okay, so here is a simple two-stage dynamic game. First, a CEO of a large company have to decide whether he or she would like to work hard or sack off. Okay, and then observing that, the shareholders of the company would decide whether to fire the CEO or keep the CEO, right? If the CEO work hard and keeping the CEO, both CEO and the shareholder will go zero. If the CEO work hard and the shareholder fire the CEO would lose 10, shareholder will lose 1. If the CEO has been lazy, slacking off, firing the CEO would lead to -5 for the CEO and -2 for the shareholder. And if the CEO has been slacking off and the shareholder keep the CEO, shareholder got 5. CEO got 5. Shareholder got -5. Okay. So in this game, it's called perfect information game because at every point, when a player would need to make a choice about their actions, they know about the full history of the move. Right? So shareholder here would know whether CEO choose slack off or not. Shareholder here would know that the CEO have chosen to work hard, and that's why a dynamic game like this is called a game with perfect information, right? So perfect information about the history of prior actions, okay? And just by now you're familiar with this kind of game, but just to exercise, we could solve this game very quickly. We do backward induction, so we look at each subgame. So let's say first, if we look at this subgame, when the shareholder is here, observing that the CEO has been slacking off, then firing the CEO give a higher payoff, -2 compared to -5. So in that subgame, the shareholder would choose to fire the CEO. And if we look at this subgame, keeping the CEO, given that the CEO have been working hard, give shareholder 0, and that would be better than firing the CEO, which give -1. So in this subgame, the shareholder would keep the CEO. Okay, so knowing how the shareholder would choose his best response in those subgame, the CEO would need to decide whether to work hard or not, right? Working hard would give stacking off would give -5, and working hard would give 0. So the CEO would choose to work hard. And therefore, a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium is such that shareholder would choose to retain the CEO if the CEO have been working hard, and shareholder would choose to fire the CEO if the CEO has been stacking off, and the CEO would choose to work hard. Okay, so pretty simple dynamic game with perfect information. Now, again, without perfect information would be again with imperfect information. Okay, so here is one example where we have potential entrants into a market, and we have an incumbent. Right? So there's an incumbent already there in a particular market, and there's another firm that could decide whether to enter the market or not. If the entrant decide to stay out, then the entrant got 0, and the incumbent could keep the existing profit too. Right? On the other hand, if the entrant decided to enter to the market, then the entrants will need to decide which segment of the market they focus on. Right? If the entrant focus on, say, the mainstream market, the large niche, they will focus on that part of the market, or the entrant could decide to focus on a smaller niche, a smaller segment there. Right? And so, if you can think about a movie company enter to a market and decide to whether to make sort of mainstream movie or some sort of movie cater to a small segment of the market, sort of animation, for example, and so on. Okay. And then the incumbent would also need to decide whether to focus on the small niche or the large niche here. The problem, though, is that we don't have perfect information. The incumbent observe that whether the entrant has entered or not. However, the incumbent does not know whether the entrant has chosen small niche or large niche. Okay, so and that's why in this information set, incumbent, when it needs to decide, it doesn't know whether it's here or there. Okay, and so we have imperfect information because incumbent doesn't know after deciding to enter whether the entrant choose small niche or the large niche of the market. Okay, so because of the imperfect information about the past actions, this is a dynamic game with imperfect information. Okay, so essentially when we look at this subgame, it's kind of like a simultaneous move game. Right? Right. So we could first look at what happened in this subgame. They play this Nash equilibrium. Right? So in this case, the entrant after entering would choose the small niche, and the incumbent would choose the large niche. In this case, the entrant would got -1, and the incumbent would got 1. Okay, knowing that would be the best response for incumbents. That would be the Nash equilibrium in this subgame. What would entrant decide? The entrant would say, well, if I stay out, I got 0 compared to -1 here. So the entrant would stay out. Okay, so this is one subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, where in this subgame, the entrant would choose small niche, and the incumbent would choose the large niche, and the entrant would stay out. Okay, it turned out that this game will have another subgame perfect Nash equilibrium as well, right? So we call that in this subgame we have another Nash equilibrium. So if we focus on this Nash equilibrium in the subgame, where the entrants choose the large niche and the incumbent choose the small niche, in this case, the entrant would got 1 in this subgame. Comparing getting 0 of stay out, the entrant would choose to enter. So another subgame perfect Nash equilibrium is that the entrant would choose enter, and after entering, the entrant would choose large niche, and the incumbent would choose small niche. Right? We call that we have imperfect information. So incumbent being here has no idea whether it is here or there. So its actions available is just either small or large. Okay. So that's a dynamic game with imperfect information. Okay. And before we talk about in this subgame, the two would move simultaneously, and in that subgame, we see that both of them focus on the large niche. Is not going to be a Nash equilibrium because it was too crowded. Both of them got -3. The incumbent could deviate and got 1 instead, right? So beneficial unilateral deviation is available. So -3, -3. That kind of payoff associated with both focusing on the large would not be a Nash equilibrium. Similarly, for the strategic profile such that both focus on the small niche is not going to be a Nash equilibrium. It will be even more crowded. However, each of them focusing on different segment is a Nash equilibrium. And it turned out that in this game we have 2 Nash equilibrium. One is that the entrant focus on the small niche and the incumbent focus on the large niche. And the other one is that the entrant focus on the large niche and the incumbent focus on the small niche. Okay. So we could look at that the whole dynamic decision with incomplete information, imperfect. Let's see what would be a game with complete information. Here is a static game with complete information that by now you should be really familiar with. It's the prisoner dilemma. Here the payoff is in terms of year of jail time. So actually it should be minus, 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 if we want to look at it as a payoff. Cooperate would be best for both of them, but it's not a Nash equilibrium, right? So because it's for each of them, cooperate is a dominated strategy, and we know that there's a unit Nash equilibrium, which is both defect and got minus 2 as payoff. Okay, so in this game we have complete information because the payoff is clear to everyone and is certain. Right? And that is the case of static game with complete information. Here is another static games with complete information. In particular, we could consider a coordination game. It's kind of like the battle of sexes that you have studied before. Here, imagine that we have two companies. Right? We have Tesla. The Tesla company produce electric vehicles, right? The car companies. Now Tesla is a car company with a market value with the largest market value in the world in terms of the value of its shares, greater than Toyota, even though it doesn't produce that many vehicles. But investors sort of believe that it has a great future, and then and therefore buy up its stock. So, and on the other hand, we have another company which produce lithium-ion battery, Panasonic. Panasonic is a electronic equipment manufacturer, and in particular in here it produces lithium-ion battery, which is the kind of battery you use in your smartphone. It is also the kind of battery that Tesla would need to use on its electric vehicle. Right? It's a coordination game. Both companies will need to decide to invest or to not invest simultaneously. Okay, so it's a 2x2 normal form game. And the thing is, to be profitable, both need to invest. So here, if both invest, each company would got $200 million. If only one of them invests, let's say if only Tesla invests but Panasonic doesn't invest, Tesla will not have enough lithium-ion battery so that it could fit into its electric car, and therefore doesn't produce enough car and wastes its investment. Right? And similarly, if Tesla doesn't invest while Panasonic invests, then you can imagine that there might be no successful electric vehicle that is really popular, and Panasonic can't sell a lot of its lithium battery, so it lose money. Right? In that case, Panasonic will lose -100. So not investing is in that case everyone got 0. As in sort of a typical coordination game, we have two Nash equilibrium, right? Only one party investing is not going to be a Nash equilibrium, which is not hard to see. You can check that. Not investing is going to be one Nash equilibrium. There's no profitable unilateral deviation, and both investing is another Nash equilibrium. Actually, this is the Pareto optimal Nash equilibrium. They will both better off in this. They will got the best outcome in this case. Okay. So this is a coordination game with complete information. Again, it's complete information because the payoff and how that payoff depends on the action of the players is clear. It's complete. Everyone know about it. Okay. It's given by this matrix. Okay, so imagine game a little bit. and say, suppose Panasonic could be one of two types with equal probability, like 50-50 probability. With 50% probability, Panasonic is a competent company, or the management of Panasonic is competent. And with another 50% chance, Panasonic is incompetent. Okay, so if Panasonic is competent, things would be similar to before. This is the payoff matrix. However, if Panasonic is not competent, the payoff metric would become this one, right? In which case that so this three cell would be similar, but in this case, even if Panasonic invests, it might not be successful. Panasonic might screw up things. So not producing quality battery. There's also defects in the battery, overheats. After building a factory, it can't make it running smoothly, so that it doesn't produce enough, and so on. Okay. So in that case, Panasonic would still lose 100, and Tesla would earn some money, but not as much, right? Maybe still got some supply or battery from Panasonic, but it's just not enough. Okay. So in this case, we have incomplete information because Tesla would not know which payoff metric it's going to be, right? So Tesla doesn't know whether Panasonic is competent or not, right? So there's some information asymmetric here. Panasonic would know about its competency, but Tesla does not. And so how should we deal with this kind of game? Okay. One way to deal with it is to think about it as if there's some sort of another player, the nature. Except that nature is not going to be strategic, and moreover, nature moves first. And then we pick whether Panasonic is competent or incompetent. Right? So with 50% chance, Panasonic is going to be competent. With another 50% chance, Panasonic is going to be incompetent. So kind of like the nature is randomizing its move in picking whether the two companies play in this kind of environment or this kind of environment. Okay, so this is going to be helpful for us to think about games with incomplete information. And actually here it describes a Bayesian game. Okay, so a Bayesian game, like any other game, has a set of players. In this case, it's just Tesla and Panasonic. Sometimes we use I to denote a generic player, 1, 2, and here we only have 2, or I is equal to Tesla, and then I is equal to Panasonic. And we have a set of action for each player. In this case, pretty simple. It's the same for Tesla as well as Panasonic, which is to invest or not invest. Right? But now we also have a set of types for each player. Okay, so for Tesla, it's simple. It's just there's only one type, competent type, let's say. And for Panasonic, there are two types. Right? Panasonic could be either competent or incompetent, and we use uppercase Greek letter theta to denote the set. Moreover, there's a probability function and describing how likely and how would be the type disputed. Okay? In this simple case, Tesla is going to be competent with probability 1. Panasonic is going to be competent with only probability 50%, and another 50% Panasonic is going to be incompetent. Okay, And in this case, the probability distribution is pretty simple because there's only one player have more than one types. Okay. Moreover, this is common knowledge. Everybody know about this distribution and know about each other's understanding about this knowledge as well. And moreover, there's a sort of a payoff function, which is in this case matrix, which tell us how the payoff depends on the actions and the types of player. Okay, so for this Bayesian game, we could extend our understanding of strategic that we sort of described before. Right? So formally, a strategic in a Bayesian game for say player I being Tesla or Panasonic is a function Si, which depends on the types of the player. Right, so in this case, whether Panasonic is competent or not, for example. Right, and then this strategy specifies the action from a feasible set. In our case, just invest and not invest. But we have to specify for each types and sort of a contingency plan, if you like. Right? So, like before, a strategic is just like a decision rule or contingency plan. Except that now we need that strategic or that decision rule or that contingency plan to depend on theta. Right? It has to specify the strategic for each type of player. So if it sounds abstract, look at our example, in which case the strategic of Tesla could be, say, invest, right? And the strategic of Panasonic is a bit more than Tesla's strategic because it has to specify an action when Panasonic is competent, right? And an action when Panasonic is incompetent, and let's say invest if Panasonic is competent and not invest if Panasonic is incompetent. So that's a strategy. Now, with that in mind, we could sort of combine it with a payoff function. A payoff function is just sort of something that describes how the payoff is going to be for each player of each type, and how that depends on the strategic of each players. Okay, so again, it's just like the payoff function we learned about before, except that now it sort of need to depends on the type of player, and we want to know how the payoff function looks like for each type. Okay? So in our previous example, it's pretty simple. The payoff functions described by this two metric, right? If Panasonic is is competent, this metric described here give us the payoff.
From a search.
And if Panasonic is incompetent, this payoff metric give us the payoff of Tesla and Panasonic depending on how they choose the actions, right? So with all these elements, we describe Bayesian game. And how do we solve this Bayesian game? Well, we solve it by looking at Bayesian Nash equilibrium. which is just a combination or profile of strategic, S star, which is in this case S star of Tesla and S star of Panasonic. If for each player I and for each types theta I of player I, the strategic maximize the expected payoff of player I. Okay, so again, it's kind of like the Nash equilibrium that we learned about before. A strategic would be one that maximizes the payoff given others strategics, and we need that to be the case for each player. Here, I just extend a little bit. Instead of calculating the payoff, I calculate the expected payoff. Okay? And that's just reflecting the fact that there's some uncertainty in the payoff. Okay? And that's why it makes it incomplete information. And so, for example, like this one is going to be a Bayesian Nash equilibrium. Right? Tesla will choose invest, and Panasonic will choose invest if it's competent, and not invest if it is incompetent. Okay? And we can check that this is the case, that they sort of satisfy the criteria for it to be a Bayesian Nash equilibrium. Right. So first, for incompetent Panasonic, investing is a strictly dominated strategy. Right. Always give minus 100 as compared to 0. Right. So we can essentially eliminate it. Not investing is going to be the best response for incompetent Panasonic. For competent Panasonic, given that, right, in this strategic profile, given that Tesla choose to invest, investing is going to give a higher payoff, right, 200 compared to 0. Right, so this strategic of Panasonic is the best response. Okay, and then we just need to check whether Tesla's strategic is also a best response given Panasonic's strategy. Well, with half of the probability, right? With half of the probability, Panasonic is going to be competent, and in this equilibrium, right, competent Panasonic is going to invest, and incompetent Panasonic is going to not invest. So investing for Tesla would give an expected payoff of half times 200, and that's what happened when Tesla is that's what happened when Panasonic is competent, right? With another 50% chance, Panasonic is not going to be competent, so investing will give minus 100. So the expected payoff of investing in this equilibrium for Tesla is 50. And not investing, in this case, we give Tesla 0 here and 0 here. So not investing, we give 0. So compare with would treat a player of different types as if they are just different players. Okay, and we know, right, given Panasonic strategic, what would be Tesla's expected payoff if it choose to invest? That would be 50, right? We can see that the expected payoff of Tesla would be higher if Tesla invests. So and therefore, Tesla is doing the best in terms of maximizing expected payoff given how Panasonic behave. And Panasonic, as we checked before, is maximizing its payoff by choosing this strategy. Okay, so this is the Bayesian Nash equilibrium. In this example, it's not much different from the usual Nash equilibrium we sort of know about. It's just that we replace the payoff with expected payoff to accommodate the uncertainty. Okay, it's Bayesian because the way they calculate the probability, it has to satisfy the Bayes rule. But in our case, we don't really need to apply the Bayes rule because the probability distribution is so simple, and the types are not correlated. Right? So we don't need to worry too much about the Bayes rule. Right? The strict definition, when the type of different player are correlated, they need to calculate the conditional probability. When they do the expectation, they do the calculate expected payoff. Right? But here, no need to worry about that because they're not depends on each other. So we can just use the prior, the 50-50 to calculate expected payoff. Okay, so just to summarize, right? So when we have imperfect information, we're talking about games where we don't have perfect information on prior action, right? The history of move before the decision maker. Okay? And whenever we talk about incomplete information, we are talking about games where some player may not have complete information on the payoff. And so in this case, it's incomplete information because Tesla have no idea whether the payoff is given by this metric or this one. Okay. One way we could sort of analyze game with incomplete information is like treating it as if it's like imperfect information. It's just that we sort of think of nature is sort of kind of another player who make the move, except they make the move first, and this is not strategic, and it picks of whether we're playing these metrics. So we're getting this payoff metric or whether we're getting this payoff metrics. Okay. So that in mind, we are ready to describe what a dynamic game with incomplete information looks like. And instead of giving you formal definition of what a dynamic game of incomplete information looks like, we're going to talk about a specific game. Right? We're going to talk about signaler game in the job market. And along the way, we'll introduce the idea of incomplete information, which is sort of, we have talked about it, just that we mix them in a dynamic game. Okay? And in this game, we are going to look at education choice and look at it from the perspective of signaling. Okay, so the way economists think about education is that they have two roles. One is that it produces human capital. Students could, through education, go into university, go into school, acquire human capital. Human capital is just an idea or concept or word that economists make up to describe the set of abilities, skills, knowledge, experience that people bring to the labor market and sort of be able to productive in the labor market. Right? So your knowledge on how the economy works, your knowledge in game theory, your knowledge in programming, writing in English, analyzing things, those would be human capital. Okay? So this is one role that economists think about education. The other role or function that we think about education is that it provides us with an instrument to signal our ability to potential employers. Okay, and the idea is that in the labor market, there would be information asymmetric. We know about our ability better than potential employer, but because of the asymmetric information, the employer may not know or may not be convinced our ability if we just tell them, right? So education provides an instrument or a way for high ability individuals to signal their ability to potential employer, okay? And we could look at a simple job market signaling model. It might look complicated plotting on a graph, but if you follow me step by step, it would become clear, okay? So here we have one firm, and the firm needs to hire a worker, but the worker could be hired as an analyst or a receptionist, okay? Analysts bring about $10 profit to the firm, and the receptionist bring about $4 profit to the firm, right? But there are two types of worker. There's a high type, high ability type, and that account for 1/3 of the population. And there is low probability type that account for 2/3 of the population. The thing is, the high types could do either job, either as analyst or as receptionist. Okay, but the low type could only do the job of a receptionist. Okay. So the firm may want to sort of learn about the ability of the potential worker. Okay. But there's an information asymmetric there. Worker knows her type, but the firm does not. Okay? But worker could choose to have higher education, denoted by E, or not have higher education, denoted by N. Okay? Firm then, after the worker choose having higher education or not, could observe that choice, and then the firm can decide whether to hire the worker as an analyst or receptionist. Okay? A crucial dynamic, so a crucial element here, as we sort of mentioned earlier a little bit, is that getting higher education is more costly for low types than high type. Right? So imagine that people with high ability, it's more likely they graduate on time and do well in exam, doesn't need to hire a tutor, and they could study with less time so that they could work. Some of them could work at the same time, and so on. So here, cost doesn't have to be financial cost. It could have psychological cost, less stressful and easier for them, and so on. Okay. But the key thing here is that one, the signal is costly, and second, it's more costly for the low type. Okay. And so it gives a possibility for the high type to take that costly signal, here taking education, to signal to the future employer that they are high type. Okay, put that all this kind of story into a game and draw a game tree. We have this one. Okay, it looks complicated, but if we follow step by step, it should be pretty clear. So first, we have the nature. The nature would decide whether the worker is a high ability type or a low ability type, right? With like 1/3 probability, it's going to be a high probability type. With 2/3 probability, it's going to be a low probability type. And then the worker, learning about their types, would choose to get education and not get high education. Okay, so here this is a high type worker, and here this is a low type worker, and for each of them, they could choose to whether to get education or not, right? So again, going to this direction is choosing to have high education. If we go into this direction on the left, it's going to be choosing not having high education. And if we are here, we're talking about high type worker. If we are here, we're talking about low type worker. Okay, then after they choose the education level, the firm observing whether the worker have high education or not would decide whether to hire the worker as an analyst or a receptionist. Okay. Again, here we have one information set, which is what it means is the firm can only observe whether the worker have education or not, but have no idea whether the firm is here or here, which is another way to say whether the worker is a high type or a low type. Right? Similar here, the firm can observe that the worker doesn't have education or higher education, but the firm doesn't know whether it's here, which means that worker has a low type, or here, which means the worker is a high type. Okay, and so and the payoff is such that, again, if it hire a high type to be analysis, then the firm would got 10. If it hire high type to be a receptionist, the firm would got 4. That's the profit from a receptionist. And since high type can do either job, and that's sort of the profit for the firm. Right? If the firm hire a receptionist, hire a worker, a low type worker that is a receptionist to be a receptionist, the firm will got 4. Right? But if they hire a low type as a receptionist, because the low type person cannot do the job, the firm, let's say, will got 0 profit. Okay? So that's the payoff for the firm. For the worker, being hired as an analyst would pay well, right? Let's say it pay 10, and it being hired as a receptionist, it pay 4. However, there's a cost of getting the education, and suppose the cost is 7 for the low type. So even if the low type is got higher as an analyst, if the low worker got education, we need to subtract, say 7 and then the payoff is only 3. If the worker got higher as a receptionist and say salary is equal to 4, but if the low-type worker got education that costs 7, it just becomes -3. Okay. And similarly, if no education, the high type got 10 as an analyst and 4 as a reception. But if the high type got education, it's costly, so the payoff would be lower. And let's say 4, in which case receptionist payoff become 0, and being high as analyst, the payoff is becomes 6. So it's kind of like for the high type education cost is 4, and for the low type education cost 7. Right. So 2 things: the signal is going to be costly for 7, but it's more costly for the low type. Right. Okay. So I think then we describe a dynamic game with incomplete information. In this game, we have 2 players. We have worker and we have firm. And the actions, the feasible action for workers would be getting higher education, E, or not getting higher education, and that's the case for either types. Firm's action would be hire the worker as an analyst or hire the worker as a receptionist. And the payoff would describe based on the number here. Okay? So how should we analyze this dynamic game with incomplete information? Okay? We will look at what is known as perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium. What is that? A perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium is a static profile and a belief that are sequential rational and consistent, in particular Bayesian consistent. What does that mean? Well, let's go through it in our example. Okay. So that's the definition of a perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium. We need them to be sequentially rational and consistent. And here is strategics and belief that constitute a perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium. Okay. In this equilibrium, the high type worker would choose to have education, and the low type worker would choose to have no education. And firm would hire worker as an analyst if it observed that the worker is educated, have chosen education, and as a receptionist if the worker have chosen to not have education. And the belief is such that the educated worker is the high type and the not educated worker has a low type. Okay? So here we have strategic and we have belief, and together they constitute a perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium. Okay, and why is that? Right. Right. So essentially, we have this. The low type worker would choose to not have education, and firm, after observing that there's no education, would choose to assign or hire the worker as a receptionist, and the high type worker would choose to have education, and observing that the worker have education, the firm would choose to hire the worker as an analyst. Bayesian Nash equilibrium because the belief and strategic profile satisfy sequential rationality and Bayesian consistency. What is that? Well, here is the definition of belief. Okay? So at each information set, the player with the move has a belief about which node the information set has been reached by the play of the game. So in our case, right, we have two information sets, either the firm is here or here. Right? If the firm observes that the worker has no education, the firm would be here. If the firm observes that the worker has education, the firm would be here. However, the firm would not know which node they are in, which means the firm doesn't know which type the worker is, right? But the firm could form a belief, right? And in this case, it could assign probability into sort of whether how likely is here and how likely is here. So in the equilibrium, the belief is such that if the firm observes someone have education with probability 1, right, so the firm will say, oh, I know for sure, I believe for sure the person have, the worker is a high type. Okay? And if it's here, the firm would say, okay, I don't know which node I am in, here or here. But if I observe N, I'm going to believe that I'm here with probability 1. Right? It doesn't have to be 0, 1. It could be some number, but we're talking about one particular equilibrium. And in that equilibrium, the firm believes that if there's no education, the worker with probability 1 is a low type. Okay, so that's the belief. Okay, and since in this information set we have two nodes, so non-singleton information set, with a singleton information set, which means that this just one node, right? The player belief is just pretty trivial. Put probability 1 on that single decision node. Right? So here we don't have that, but even if we have, it's pretty simple. So that's belief, right? And if we sort of go back to our coordination game, which also have incomplete information, but we don't have dynamic, right? Because they move at the same time, right? But for that game, we could also describe belief. It's just that the belief pretty simple. The belief about which node they are in, right? Is like it's just based on the probability that nature, how nature will pick. Like 50% is here, 50% is here, depending on whether Benson is competent or not. Right? So so here, same idea. Okay, so what is sequential rationality, and what strategies are sequentially rational? Well, it's sequentially rational if, given that belief, the player's strategies are optimal. Sorry, there's a typo here. It should be optimal, not optional. It's optimal at that information set. Okay. And so if a strategy is such that given the belief at each information set, the player is optimizing its expected payoff given their belief, right? Given their sort of probability distribution of being here or compared to there. And here, when we say subsequent strategic, is a complete plan of action covering every contingency that might arise after the given information set has been reached. in our game, it's pretty simple because, well, there's only 2 stages. So there's no more subsequent strategy. But if we have more than 2 stages, we sort of need to be optimal, and we need to specify the strategy such that it sort of cover every contingency. Okay. So here, choosing to hire an educated worker as an analyst is going to be sequentially optimal because, okay, let's take a step back. The strategic plan of the firm, which is to hire a worker as an analyst if it is an educated worker, and hire a worker as a receptionist if it's not an educated worker. Okay? That would be sequentially rational because given that high-type worker is going to choose to educate and low-type worker is going to choose to not have education, and given that the belief is such that if the worker has education, with probability 1, the firm is here. If the worker has no education, with probability 1, the firm is here. So given that, we could say, okay, this is the optimal choice by hiring an educated worker because 10 is greater than 4, right? Right. With that, we know we're here, so we only look at these 2 numbers. So that's a good move. And given that the firm observe no education, then hiring it as a receptionist is going to be optimal because 4 is greater than 0. Right? Because given that we have a belief that we are here for sure. Okay? So that's optimal on the part of firm. So in that case, we say the firm is sequentially rational. Right? And similarly, for a worker, right? So for a worker, so knowing that if the firm observe education, he or she would be hired as an analyst. So here, and if someone is not doesn't have a doesn't have education, it would be hired as receptionist. Then a high type would say, okay, let's compare the number. 6 here is greater than 4, so choose education. And a low type would say, well, 4 here is greater than 3, and therefore no education. Okay, so again, given how in equilibrium the firm would choose, it's sequentially rational for the worker to choose education if it's a high type and no education if it is a low type. Okay, so that's sequential rationality. It's just that extend the idea of behaving optimally given others' behavior in a setting of this dynamic game with incomplete information, right? So because with incomplete information, we need to introduce the belief and consider the sort of the sequence of the move as well. Okay. So that's sequential rationality. We also need equilibrium to be consistent, and for that, so we need to distinguish whether it is on the equilibrium path or not. Right. So for for given equilibrium in a given extensive form game, an information set is on the equilibrium path if it would be reached with positive probability if the game is played according to equilibrium strategy. So in our case, because 1/3 probability is a high type, and in that equilibrium, the high type will choose E. So with 1/3 probability, this information is rich, and with 2/3 probability, it's a low type worker, which is no. So here, 2/3 probability. So these two information set are both on the equilibrium path. Okay, and here we don't have a sort of the information set that is off equilibrium path. But if we do, if there's no positive probability that the equilibrium path would be reached based on how the player would play in the equilibrium strategy, they would be off equilibrium path. Okay. We need the belief to be Bayesian consistent, which is to say that if the information set that are on equilibrium path, the belief has to be determined by Bayes' rule, okay? Okay, which is the rule relate the conditional probability, right? And so the belief has to be determined by the Bayes' rule and the player's equilibrium strategy. Okay. Right. So basically, right, the player's strategic is that if a high type worker will choose E and a low type worker will choose N. Right. So that means with probability 1, the worker observing E will sure is here. With probability 1, after observing N, the firm will know is here. Okay, so in this case, the Bayes rule is pretty sort of intuitive. We don't really need the Bayes rule to calculate the probability. We could, right? The reason that we talk about off equilibrium path is just that sometime in some game, there's some information set is not going to be rich with positive probability, and then just to sort of make the definition sort of more complete, in those cases, belief would need to determine by the Bayes rule and the player's equilibrium strategy where possible. Sometimes may not be. In that case, that's fine. Okay. To do that, I would just apply the Bayes rule, right, and determine that basically it means that the belief has to be consistent with how the player played their strategy in equilibrium by applying the Bayesian rule, the Bayes rule. Okay. So that's Bayesian consistency. And to wrap it up, right, so we also mentioned this before, sequential rationality means that at information E here, right, sorry, not here, this one. Right. After observing allocation, 10 is going to be greater than 4 because like with probability 1 that the firm no is here. If it's not 1, it's some number below 0 and 1, than to the expected payoff. Okay? That could happen if, say, we have some mixed strategic, or if both type of worker would choose the high type, right? But in this equilibrium, we don't. Okay? So that makes the calculation simple. And similarly, if it's a low type, the firm would sort of realize that it's here, so 4 is greater than 0, so choose it as a receptionist. Okay, and sequential rationality for the worker, knowing that getting education would mean being hired as an analyst. So this number and this number, while 4 is greater than 3. So sequential rationality means that worker is choosing here, choosing no education, okay, wanting to be here instead of here. Okay, so like if a strategic profile and belief satisfy sequential rationality and Bayesian consistency, is going to be a perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium. In this case, the two decision nodes are both on the equilibrium path because it's positive probability they are there. So apply the Bayes rule. Right? What is the probability that after observing E, what's the probability that this is high type? So this is the Bayes rule. The probability of observing education, which is so entirely driven by the high type here, because this part is 0. So calculate is 1, and similarly, we can calculate the probability that observing a high type, if we observe that the worker doesn't have education. Right? Again, this is the Bayes rule. And we could do that calculation and find out this is 0. So 0 probability here, and since there's only 2 nodes here, probability 1 here. So that's the Bayesian. That's a dynamic game with incomplete information. Right? If in this, the high type would choose to have education, and the low type would choose to not have education. And by doing so, they signal to the potential employer about the types. Okay? In this case, the two types of worker choose different education level. Right? And therefore, in this case, the education would function as a separating signal, which separate the high types and the low types. For this to work, we need the cost to get the signal, in this case education, to be lower for the high types. Right? So intuitive thing about it, being higher as an analyst, being perceived to be a high type, pay more. Right? So if the cost of education is similar for the high type and low type, then there's a strong incentive for the low type to also get education and pretend to be a high type. Right? In that case, you can't have a separated equilibrium anymore. Okay? And in this setting, the relatively low cost of education could be due to traits that are valuable in the labor market, such as intellect, diligence, perseverance, creativity, and so on. Right? So, and for that reason, it gives the high type worker a lower cost of getting that signal, but it also means that that kind of worker could be more productive. for the potential employer. Right? Keep in mind that a separating equilibrium may not exist, right? Like the case when I mentioned, if the cost between the high tide and low tide in getting the signal is the same, or even it doesn't have to be the same. If they are small enough, then it's possible that in the signaling model, there's no separating equilibrium anymore. Right? So they might be choosing the same thing, and therefore employer may not be able to distinguish the two. Okay, so this is a simple binary separating equilibrium. We could formulate the job market signaling model differently, and for some of you, it might be a little bit more intuitive to think about how it connects to the economic phenomena. So let us briefly talk about it, and you could work it out as an exercise at home. Okay, again, we have two types, high type and low type in this model. Each account for half of the population. Productivity of high type is higher, and productivity of for the low type is 10. In this case, there are many employers, and they are willing to pay individual a wage equal to the employee's productivity. Okay, so a competitive on the side of employers, and we just say this to abstract away from looking at competition between employer. Okay. For some, this would simplify things a little bit. Again, only individuals know about their times. Employer doesn't. And so people have the option of going to university or not. Right? The cost of going to university differ for different types. Again, the high type have a lower cost at 2, and the low type have higher cost at 6. The question is whether they would go to university or not. Again, in this setting, we have a separating equilibrium. High type would go to university, low type would not go to university. Okay. And so, in the equilibrium, people with a university degree would be all high types, and people without university degree would be all low types. Right? So in that case, it's going to be Bayesian consistent. Okay, the belief on the part of employer would be consistent with how different types of worker choose education level. And so, employer is willing to pay the productivity, so 15 to college graduates and 10 to non-graduate. For the payoff in that equilibrium for the high type is going to be 15 minus the cost for the high type 2 equal to 13. For the low type, no university, so no education cost, but got a lower wage, which is 10. In this case, we again have a separating equilibrium because no one has an incentive to pretend to be the other type by making a different educational choice. Right? If a high type pretends to be a low type and does not get education, it will get 10. Right? It has no cost of going to university, but the payoff is lower. And similarly, if the low type try to pretend to be a high type, it would got paid as if it's a high type, which is 15, but it pay a cost. Moreover, the cost is going to be larger because it's a low type. So that would be 15 minus 6. Right? In the last slide, we sort of mentioned that the cost for the low type to get university degree is 6. And that would be 9, which is smaller than 10. So in this case, high type has no incentive to deviate and pretend to be a low type. And more importantly, the low type will have no incentive to deviate and pretend to be a high type. In our game theoretic language, they are sequentially rational, and moreover, the employers form the belief based on equilibrium play, okay, which is a quote-unquote correct belief. Okay? So, so this is again a separating equilibrium. It's just so we formulate the job market signaling model a little bit here, and if it's a little bit confusing for you, forget about it. Just focus on our last one. But if for some of you it may be more intuitive, connecting the economics idea with the model. Okay, so we can check that exercise. You can sort of think about it. What happens if we change the cost of going to university, such that for the high type is 1, for low type is 2. You can check the separating equilibrium like the one we mentioned earlier, whether it exists or not. Right? Again, you can check whether is there any types of worker that they have a profitable deviation, and that's to say whether there's a type of worker could be getting more by pretending to be another type. Right? If so, that's not an equilibrium, and so we may not have a separating equilibrium. Okay, that would happen in case like this one, where the cost difference between these two is relatively small, and so the low type will have a strong incentive to make the high type. And so we might have a pooling equilibrium instead, where both high type and low type attend college. Okay. In the pooling equilibrium, since half of the college would graduate are low types, the employer would offer the expected wage, which is 12.5 equal to half times 15 plus half times 10. Okay, so that's for pooling equilibrium with no sort of functional signal. Okay. So, and since we sort of mentioned education here, I just want to sort of make some remark that so here education, or in general education, so sometimes could signal in the labor market, although not always. That depends. But through sort of other study, economists tend to think that education, the primary function of education is not signaling, but rather to make human capital, to make students more productive in their what kind of jobs they have in the future. And in general, to be an educated person is a good thing. There's some evidence that education could signal in some setting, but in general, that probably is not the dominant role of education. And the reason is there are different other ways to do signaling, other less expensive way to do signaling. Right, so if employer look for intelligent, IQ test is less expensive than attending university for a few years. And there's some study that sort of show, so even conditional on some ability measures such as IQ, like for example in the US, in order to join the Air Force, they would test applicant IQ first. So for some data, they got the IQ measure, and if that's all sort of mainly about IQ, then conditional or controlling for the IQ education may not have an impact. But what they found is, well, there's still a substantial wage and earning difference between people with different level of education. Even one factor in intelligence. Right? So that sort of suggests that education is more than sort of a signal of IQ. And there's some evidence that the quality of education matter. And that again, so more likely to relate to human capital production as compared to signaling. And also there's evidence that education positively affects other non-market outcomes, such as having better health, more likely to participate in the civic society. And also another reason why signaling may not be a dominant role of education is that employers potentially could learn about employees' work performance fairly quickly, in a few months, in a year or so. And in many countries such as China and US, less so in European countries, but in countries such as China and US, the cost of firing people is relatively low, so the cost of making an error on the side of employer may not be high, so they could learn about the employees' ability, work performance very quickly, and can afford to make some error. Okay? For those reasons, we tend to think that education is more about human capital. It doesn't mean that signaling model is not useful. It's just that it might be more useful in other contexts. So we use it in education because it's just the initial idea comes from job market signaling. For example, the signaling model could be useful to think about those examples like we mentioned, right? Advertising and providing warranty, and in finance, people use signaling to consider why firms choose their financing decision, how firms decide policy to pay out dividends. Right? So for example, if you look at a lot of firms, their profit, their earning fluctuate quite a lot over the year, but their dividend is relatively stable. And even if they sort of had some loss, management tend to not so willing to cut dividends. And why people think about it is that it's maybe that the management try to signal that they manage the firm well and the prospect of the firm is well, so that any fluctuation is going to be temporary. They could generate enough cash flow for the company in the future to pay out the stable dividends. And by doing that, they try to signal to the investor, the shareholder, any drop in profit is going to be temporary.